I want to give you two scenarios. Scenario number one, a plane crashes. Scenario number two, two cars collide. In scenario number one, we pull out all the stops. We bring in the NTSB, we try to figure out exactly what went wrong. Scenario number two, we send out the cops, we sweep up the mess and we go on our way.
If we collectively, everyone on this call and the broader Strong Towns movement, if we do this right, we are going to save thousands of lives.
Mayors and local council members want to do the right thing. They have the ability to solve it. We're going to help provide those tools for them.
Well, welcome to the Strong Towns Crash Analysis Studio. We're glad that you're here. My name is Tony Harris, and I'm the Action Team Coordinator with Strong Towns. And in a moment, I'll introduce you to the rest of our expert panel. But first, let's talk about why we're here. Last year, over 40,000 people died in automobile crashes in the United States alone. Hundreds of thousands more suffered traumatic injuries. And despite the best efforts of public safety officials, these numbers have been increasing, and they affect all of our lives. There's a prevalent misconception that car crashes are caused solely by the mistakes that drivers make. Looking at your phone, changing the radio, drinking alcohol, speeding. When a crash occurs, the North American response is to send out law enforcement and insurance agencies to assign blame. We ask the questions, who made the mistake that caused this crash? Who should we blame? The reality is that crashes are caused by multiple factors, not just driver error. When a traumatic crash occurs, we need to identify all the contributing factors and learn all we can from the experience so that we can reduce the number of deaths and traumatic injuries in our communities. What you're going to see now is a crash analysis studio. Drawing from the best practices of the medical profession, we've convened a panel to review a crash that happened in Ottawa, Ontario. During this crash, a driver hit two pedestrians. Though one of the pedestrians survived, their companion died in the hospital shortly after the collision. Today, I'll start by introducing you to our panel, then review the facts of the crash, and with our guests, we'll assess the design factors that contributed to the collision. Again, our goal is not to assign blame. Our objective is to learn as much as possible about what happened and identify the many factors that contributed to this unfortunate event. So before we get into the details and talk with our experts, we need to begin with the fact that this tragedy resulted in the death of a pedestrian. Please take a moment of silence with me to honor and acknowledge her and the loss of her life. Thank you. I'm now going to introduce our expert panel for today. So first we have Suzanne Woo, a professional engineer who specializes in road safety and community traffic issues. She was the senior engineer of road safety engineering at the City of Ottawa for over 7 years and has performed engineering safety reviews at countless locations across Canada during her 25 years of work experience. She currently co-chairs the Transportation Association of Canada's Vision Zero and Safe System Approach Subcommittee. Most importantly, Suzanne is a mother of two, a wife, and an active community member who believes in the power of involving and engaging the community in all matters related to transportation, especially safety. Next, we have Toon Dreessen, president of Architects DCA, an Ottawa-based architectural practice with roots that date back more than 25 years. Toon guides the company's activism, leads project development initiatives, and is responsible for award-winning infill development work. Toon is a respected public speaker and published author. He's been featured on the Globe and Mail, CBC Radio, Ottawa Citizen, and other news publications. His background and interest in design thinking has made him interested in Strong Towns and other similar nonprofit ventures. Next, we have Rob Wilkinson, who has worked in municipal government for over 22 years, with the last 10 formerly directing the award-winning Safer Roads Ottawa program. He was the main catalyst in the creation of the first ever Fatal Collision Review Committee in Ottawa, which helps advance traffic safety awareness and prevent crash-related fatalities and injuries. Having been a part of the investigating team for over 100 fatal crashes, Rob is keenly aware of how environmental factors, driver behavior, and aspects of road design can all influence the severity and likelihood of car crashes. Rob joins our panel today as a concerned citizen and road safety consultant for better and safer transportation systems. And finally, we have Chuck Marohn, the president and founder of Strong Towns, a civil engineer and author of the book, Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, Transportation for a Strong Town. Chuck developed the initial idea for the crash analysis studio. So now I will walk us through the details of this crash in Ottawa. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So, pardon me. There we go. So what we know about this crash, we know that 2 young women were hit by a Mazda 3 at the intersection of King Edward Avenue and Somerset Street East. We know that one of the women suffered serious injuries and survived, and the second died from her injuries in the hospital after the crash. We know that the crash occurred at 5:38 a.m. on October 18th, 2022. Our nominator submitted a Freedom of Information request to get access to the crash report, but was denied because the document contains personal information and our nominator's name was not listed as a party in the report. We know that the Ottawa Open Data Portal online indicates it was wet and dark in Ottawa that morning. So Clever, our nominator, documented that the King Edward Avenue speed limit is posted at 40 kilometers per hour, which is about 25 miles per hour. We know that the motorist was traveling in the northbound lane on King Edward Avenue, and media coverage leads us to believe that the pedestrians were in the crosswalk along King Edward Avenue on the south side of the intersection. So here you can see the crash location. And we've used blue squares to illustrate the 2 pedestrians and where we believe they were standing. And then the yellow rectangle depicts the motorists and their path into the intersection, with the collision location being outlined in red there. So media coverage tells us that a paramedic coming off of night shift was the first on the scene, with other units following shortly after. We know that after the crash, both pedestrians were transported to the Ottawa Hospital Civic Campus Trauma Unit, and police said that investigators wanted to speak with anyone who witnessed the collision or had further information. So again, as we stated, the speed limit on King Edward is 40 kilometers per hour, and this segment of King Edward consists of sidewalks on either side. There's a through traffic lane in each direction, so one going north and one going south. And then there's a center lane for left-hand turns. We can see streetlights are placed evenly apart on the southbound side of King Edward. And then we can also see that traffic signals at this intersection are backplated. So here is a map of the area surrounding the crash location. We just wanted to give a feel for what this area kind of looks like. We're looking at an auto-oriented urban development pattern here. The crash location, which is marked with the red pin, of course, is north of both the Trans-Canada Highway and Mann Avenue. We know that King Edward is also reportedly used as an alternative to highway travel, at least by some travelers. And then we know that the location is nearby the University of Ottawa, which has multiple university buildings in the area and more than 44,000 attending students. We see a mix of residential and commercial uses. And we also know that this area is frequented by travelers, crossing to Quebec province. So here's the crash location outlined once more in red. You can see the intersection here. And you can see that there are various university buildings. So Henderson Residence Hall here, a couple different complexes over on this side, and then a few restaurants in the immediate area. So our nominator, Clever, gathered some useful photos and footage of the area that I want to walk us through briefly. This is the crash location, and we can see that there is a memorial here. Now, if we were to zoom in, you would see that this memorial reads RIP Pamela. Since we don't have the crash report, we're not entirely sure if that's the person who lost their life during this collision, though it may very well be. And then here is the same area from a pedestrian perspective, looking toward the northwest. And then next we have a shot from the point of view of a northbound motorist approaching the intersection. So this is a couple blocks south of where the crash took place. But I wanted to include this just to illustrate that the area is frequented by motorists and pedestrians alike. And then from that same northbound motorist perspective, we have two shots here, one entering into the intersection with Somerset Street East, and then one passing through the intersection, again as a motorist. And then just for a little more perspective, we've included a shot here of the intersection just from the opposite direction. So this is looking south. Next, we have some measurements of northbound King Edward. So I just want to highlight the turn lane in the center there is 11 feet wide. And then the northbound traffic lane, drive lane on the right-hand side here is about 13 1/3 feet wide. We know that from sidewalk to sidewalk, we're looking at 52 feet in width. And then we can see that from planning strip to planning strip on either side brings that width up to 83 feet. So Kleber, our nominator, also managed to conduct a speed study for us at this crash location. He noted that traffic was heavier than usual at the time of the study, and that light rail transit was closed at the time of the study as well. So there were more buses on the road than what he considered to be typical. So we found that during this study period, 59% of drivers were speeding. So they were going faster than the 40 km/h speed limit. And we noted that of the 394 cars tracked, 85% of them were traveling at or below 48 km/h. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And now I'd like to turn to our panel so that we can kind of talk through factors that we see at work here. Suzanne, if we could start with you, could you tell us a little bit about what you think might have contributed to this crash? And if you have Google Street View up and would like to screen share or point anything out, please feel free.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I think you did a great description setting the tone and the context. And I just wanted to kind of emphasize that this is a large university campus on one side and a residential area on the other. So there are a lot of pedestrians and cyclists in the area. And there is a lot of desire to cross King Edward. Also, if you think about why people would be using King Edward, I just wanted to note it's not a truck route. So trucks are directed to take other routes, but it is the most direct point to get to Quebec from the highway, which means that I think a lot of people who are going through there they don't have a destination within the area. They're going from a distant location to a distant location. And yeah, also it's a very constrained area. So usually when you have these roads that carry a lot of people from distant locations, that it's not as constrained as this. And King Edward does, at different sections along the way, it does get much wider and much bigger, and that's a reflection of its necessity in the network. So those are some of the things. I guess in terms of when we did a site visit, so we noticed that it was very constrained. It does have a lot of pavement markings, so there are the painted zebra markings and the ladder markings, but I think from the photos that you just showed that there was resurfacing at the time, so it might be that there weren't the pavement markings may not have been there at the time, so that might have been a factor. We also noted that the sight lines were not great. So there is a building right on the corner, and the setbacks are small. So that means like the building is quite close, and usually, we would check for sight triangles, which means what is the visibility of each of the vehicles or pedestrians, can they see each other as they're approaching? And in this case, not only was there the building, but there's also a lot of overgrown vegetation, and there were a lot of signs. Like, there were way more signs than a driver could digest. So not sure if those signs were all there, because some of them looked temporary. But we also noticed that the signal control box was mounted high, and it really does block your visibility of pedestrians as you're approaching from the south. The other thing that's notable is that this is at the top of a hill. So if you're a driver and you're trying to maintain a speed, you might be stepping on the gas a little bit more. And then when you get to the top, you might not realize that you are accelerating still. So yeah, I think, but the big things were that it was dark, right? So visibility is already a factor. It's dark, and then the speed, and we don't know what speed the driver was driving at, and we don't know where the pedestrians were, and if they were they were running, but we have to assume that they didn't see each other. I guess the other thing, because it was early in the morning, was potentially driver fatigue. So if you're driving at that time, are you more tired? Are you less aware? But for sure, I think both parties would probably have had a lower expectation of encountering each other, just because of the time of day. So yeah, those are my notes.
Great, thank you. Yeah, the driver fatigue portion is something that I've been curious about, especially given the time. And like you said, there's certain elements and pieces of information that we simply don't know. So it's hard to really account for everything. Thank you. Toon, could we turn to you next in terms of factors and what you see contributing here?
Unmute. So I think one of the factors is that, and I hate to use the term that's bandied about politically, is that there's a sense of balance. There's a responsibility on the part of a vehicle driver, whether you're driving a Mazda or driving a massive truck, to drive at the appropriate speed, and that the harm that can be caused by having that vehicle is different than if you're a cyclist or a pedestrian. A cyclist bumping into somebody even at speed is not going to cause the same degree of injury that a car, even traveling at 40 kilometers an hour, would. And so there's a responsibility that has to be thought about. And that goes to the heart of work associated with Vision Zero. And what I see as a particular challenge is the resistance that is made to integrating proper safe design in the way we design our streets. So for example, the street, and if I can share the screen, when you look at the street, it has a fairly narrow sidewalk as you go up King Edward. It has a fairly narrow sidewalk. It's probably maybe it's 2 meters and maybe it's 1.5 meters, but it's not very wide. And there's no boulevard, and the curb is quite low, and the street trees are off to the side. Would a boulevard on a narrowed roadway have saved somebody? Probably not, given that they were in the intersection. But the street is quite wide, and at that early time of day, likely not a lot of traffic. So somebody sort of zipping up the street feels like they have 3 lanes, and that sense of openness leads to a little extra weight on the gas pedal as they're climbing the hill. As you go up the hill and you come to the intersection, again, it widens back out to 3 lanes, and we have a painted stripe in the middle. If that painted stripe had been a concrete traffic island in the middle, that might have made the road feel narrower and induced a sense of slower speed. We have the left turn lane because we believe that it's important that someone can turn, make a left turn into what is largely a car-free campus. And I think we should question design decisions around why we allow vehicles to go in here. Yes, there's a parking lot, but you have to get here from a left turn lane. Maybe if that left turn lane was not there, that would have been different. If this intersection was a raised intersection, not only would that be more accessible, but it would cause crossing traffic to be slower because you'd have to slow down. That's not going to impact somebody who's already, in crossing the intersection and has reached the point where they're going to, have an accident with and drive into somebody. But that kind of knowledge of the road would encourage people to drive slower. And I think part of this is also that Ottawa U has grown over the decades to be a much bigger campus than it used to be. And that's caused a tension with the neighborhood in that the university campus is expanding eastward with additional buildings, residences, and so forth. And that's going to cause more people to want to cross what used to be kind of the border of King Edward. And that's going to have an impact on the number of people who are going to cross the street. And so I think we should really think about King Edward as being treated like a Woonerf, a slow speed street, maximum 20-kilometer-an-hour streets, very focus on pedestrian use first, and not as a thoroughfare to get quickly to King Edward Avenue, which north of this impact site becomes 8 lanes wide for a trucking route to the highway. And I think those are design decisions that we really have to think about as the city we want to be.
Thank you. Yeah, those seem like very significant design decisions to me. And the components about kind of going up the hill and acceleration was something I hadn't necessarily thought about thoroughly before. Rob, could we get your thoughts on contributing factors?
For sure. Thanks, Tony. And just to echo some of the pieces that I think Suzanne and Toon have brought up, is we really have to, as cities, not this particular city, but cities in general, really mature our thinking in a lot of ways, right? In terms of how do we want people to safely move through our cities? Like, enough of just thinking they're just going to do it, they'll figure it out. We, as legislators or as regulators, if you will, in that Vision Zero principle, too often the responsibility is pushed onto the individual road users. So what, in this case, a lot of people will say, well, what were those pedestrians doing crossing at that time? Were they crossing with the right of way? Was the vehicle driver going too quickly? But to Toon's point, as the people, as cities are responsible for those roads, it falls really on the cities to do more to prevent this from happening and making smarter and more mature decisions. The one piece for us, when we talk about what information is available to the city or to residents and people who want to make their city safer and better, it really kind of, reminds me of how important it was to really get this first fatal collision review committee established and get it off the ground. And I know we'll probably circle back to that, but those questions that, that came up in the chat in terms of how fast was the driver going? What was did they have any kind of medical history, or what was their driving history? Were they a good or bad driver? All those things would come up naturally and very pointedly in an FCRC meeting. And so we'll talk about that a little bit later, Tony, but I think a lot of the answers really come down to, as cities mature and as residents demand more, it really falls on city staff and city leaders to change what really are, in some cases, more archaic views about moving people quickly and moving and switching that mindset to the role of the municipality is to make sure that people move safely. And it's a big switch, right? It's a really, really big switch.
Yeah, that's an important switch, I think, in terms of mindset as we look at this intersection and other intersections where crashes are occurring. Thank you. Chuck, anything on contributing factors?
Yeah, thank you, Tony. When I look at this intersection and I look at this area, I really am struck by, I'll say this on a personal level. We just sent our oldest daughter to college. And, one of the main things that I think you think of as after you drop them off and go away is are they safe, right? Like, are they safe? And I just think about like the tragedy of having really a design that is out of alignment or misplaced with this area. This is a beautiful urban area. It's an area that, we have students living out what you'd hope would be some of the best years of their lives. And you have this like very, very dangerous situation designed in some ways indifferent to their experience and their needs and how they would be in this place. The intersection that we're talking about is up here, but I want to zoom out a little bit and go down to this intersection here, because I feel like a lot of the contributing factors to the speed, we don't, because we don't have the crash report, we don't know, did the investigation say that speed was an issue? We've done the speed study out there, and certainly speeding is an issue. And I think when we look at the design, it's kind of easy to understand why. If we drop in here, you are in essentially two highways coming into a downtown. And in fact, the highway itself extends a little bit into here. You can see, in a sense, an at grade on ramp into the downtown area, or off ramp from the highway into that. This is a very generous sweeping curve. The geometry of this curve is designed to facilitate speed. So people who are entering what is an urban area are going to be entering this at speed with all the visual cues that they have, besides the one, the one sign that says the speed limit. It's on the other side of this here. This little sign here is saying 40 maximum. Everything else in this environment is saying much, much faster than that. Drive far faster than that. I think it's important too, the visual cues here. This area says to a driver, just because of the geometry of the buildings, the fact that the buildings don't come up and front the street, they're set back. There's a long kind of dead space along them. What it cues you into is that you're not in an area with a lot of complexity. You're in an area with a lot of simplicity. And so when you're in an area with a lot of simplicity, you can kind of, as a driver, zone out and not have to pay much attention. Of course, we know that this is not an area with simplicity. There's a lot of people here. They're going to be crossing here in different places. But it's easy to see how a driver at this point could be lulled into a sense of thinking, as I go up this hill, I can hit the accelerator. There's nothing here. Both sides are kind of clear. Everything is kind of clear and easy. And, there's nothing really causing me any friction or any distress. I do note that the lengths of these blocks are very long. Between this point here and the crash site is this intersection, and the next intersection is 660 feet. It's a long, over 300 meters. It's a long stretch. I'm sorry, over 200 meters. My English to imperial conversions are not what you all in Ottawa, I'm sure, are used to having to do. It's a long stretch. And when you have a long stretch like that, as a designer, as someone who's looking at this, we kind of know inherently that drivers tend to pick up speed. The longer the blocks are, kind of the more time you have to pick up speed between that and the time you get to the next intersection, the next space. That sense is reinforced here on this second block, because when you get to the second block, again, you have a very large building that doesn't front the street, a building that is set back, a building whose geometry says, don't worry about me. Don't worry about anything on this side because there's no action here. On the other side of the street, you have the same thing. You do have the little entrance here. So maybe if there was a vehicle, but for the most part, you're not worried about people crossing, people walking, people on bikes. There's no visual cues here that you need to be concerned about anything. And so you can imagine someone at 5:30 in the morning or what have you, or you imagine someone really at any time of the day, if the street was open and clear, feeling like you had free flow, a free flowing condition with very little obstacles and very few things in your way. Incidentally, I know that along part of the street, there is on-street parking. I saw some photos and some of the things we looked at, and I think there's a couple here on Google Earth that show people actually parked here. But these are not places where you're going to have a lot of parking. And so what you end up, just because it doesn't feel safe to park there, there's no real reason to park there. There's adequate parking in other places. And so what happens is that the street is wide enough to accommodate a wide driving lane and a parking lane. And it effectively becomes just a really, really wide drag strip style driving lane without the cars there to create that edge friction. When we get up to here, you do have this kind of beginning of, and I think this is kind of the spot right here, a beginning where your peripheral vision starts to suggest an urban area. It starts to suggest that this is going to be different, and maybe you should transition your thinking from the highway kind of pattern to something more urban. There's nothing in the street design that suggests that. The street design doesn't change at all. The geometry of the street stays the exact same. It stays as essentially highway dimensions, but the periphery starts to change ever so subtly. At the speed that you're going, the time before you really register that shift and the time you may actually adjust is going to take you to the intersection. There isn't enough transition here for you to see, we've entered a new space, a new kind of spatial awareness, and adjust to that before you are at the intersection where the crash occurred. I noticed a couple things about this intersection that give me some pause in terms of overall design. At 5:30 in the morning, this would be dark, right? There is one street light, and I think you can see it up there. When you look at that street light itself, there isn't another one that I could pick out or see in this intersection, and none of our other things showed one either. If the people that were standing here were hit walking out in this place, this light here is not a light that is going to shine through the entire intersection. And those kind of lights, those older kind of incandescent lights, are really they're kind of infamous for spraying light in a lot of places, but actually creating a lot of shadow and a lot of darkness. We saw this earlier this year when we looked at the Hyattsville situation. The intersection was lit up for the driver's eye, but it put the person walking, the person standing on the edge, in darkness, in actually extra shadow. In a sense, it provided a blinding light in the street, but nothing really to denote anybody on the edge. And it feels like we have a little bit of that situation here. Certainly the area where the people would have been standing before they stepped out would not have been well lit. And there are reasons to expect that they actually would have been maybe hidden in a shadow created by this lighting situation. I also just took note. I know that it looks like whoever owns this building, the kind of first building as we come here, takes some care with their plantings. You get into a little bit what I think would call more natural situation. It's not really urban vegetation, but it is kind of this trend. And from where we're sitting right here, this intersection here on the right where someone would be standing is rather obscured. It was easy to see how someone could blend in, someone could not be seen, even if they were out beyond this vegetation. With the lighting effects and the speed, that was probably one of the factors here in someone not noticing someone, and certainly someone standing on the edge may perhaps not noticing an oncoming vehicle coming at speed either. I think the lights, the traffic signals here are probably adequate for an urban intersection. They are a little bit, they're a little bit diminutive in the sense that they don't, if we were in a strode environment, a more suburban kind of environment where you had the traffic volumes, you would expect a more visible signal presence. This is an urban signal. And I feel like the signal works in this urban intersection, but only if you had urban speeds, and only if you had speeds that were slower, if you had some type of proactive way of slowing people down heading into this intersection, then this more diminutive kind of urban signalized intersection works really well. With the speeds that you have coming through here, and with the highway kind of cross section that you have in the street, this traffic signal winds up to be more of a suggestion as opposed to a really rigid stop. And I think looking at the geometry and the way you would approach this intersection at speed, as well as that vegetation, it's easy to see how someone could, it's easy to see how someone could miss. You're still seeing my Google. I accidentally hit the wrong button here. Tony, you're still seeing Google for me?
I am, yeah.
Okay. It's easy to see how someone could miss that particular traffic signal. The last thing that I noticed, and this goes a little bit to what Tone said, and I think it was right on about the left turn lane. This left turn lane is designed, I mean, look at the length of it. I realize that part of it is to turn into this business here, but this is really designed with a mentality of stacking. How we're going to have so many vehicles turning left that we need to get them out of the way and let them stack up so that the through traffic is unhindered. And at 5:30 in the morning, there's certainly, I mean, my guess is there not a lot of stacking here. You can see in this photo, no stacking on the other side, but plenty of through traffic. In an urban intersection like this, especially at a university, and a little bit with the data that we collected out here suggests, as Tone kind of reinforced, there's probably not a lot of people taking this left turn going into this university. There's probably not a lot of volume there, demand there. It would be very easy to have this intersection tighten up quite a bit and allow people to enter that space, navigate around each other, and let the turning traffic kind of sit there out in the middle, make the turn when they're available, but not have a dedicated turn lane. The fact that there is a dedicated turn lane there and that it's not used or very lightly used or unnecessary just adds that extra dimension of space that gives that driver the kind of comforting reinforcement that there's nothing that they need to worry about here. There's nothing that they need to be heightened and aware of here. And it allows them to enter this intersection kind of lulled into a false sense of security. So that's what I've got, Tony. I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck. That was really, really helpful to hear. Tone, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add just some thoughts. I think a lot of what you had to say, Chuck, is really right on. Part of the challenge is that this stretch of King Edward, as you go down the hill, on the right side, what you see is the university's central heating plant. And this was sort of on the edge of what was the university in the 60s. And this was all sort of residential neighborhood and stuff here. And so this central heating plant doesn't really get any visitors. It's not like people go to it. No one other than maybe the occasional mechanical engineer, no one really goes and hangs out at the central heating plant for funsies. But it does have, truck needs and, deliveries and all that kind of nonsense. So they do need to have this access, but there's not like there's like a lot of pedestrians crossing here. And the new building that was built, this is one of the science and research buildings, for whatever functional reason, I have no idea who designed it or why, but it doesn't really have any connection to the street. So as you're right, this is sort of a really long, desolate block. But that doesn't stop, the city from saying, wow, this is a 600 and whatever you said, foot long, uninterrupted street. We should have some mid-block crossings. And to create some mid-block crossings across here with a traffic island that's, concrete in the middle and actually improve this street, the fact that if it was a mid-block crossing with a raised intersection would slow traffic down. And I know that in a couple of design projects I've worked on, I've proposed things like raised pedestrian crossings and been told, no, can't do that because it's going to interfere with snow plowing operations. And I think that's something we really have to address as a mentality is, do we design our city for the convenience of a snowplow operator, or do we design our city for people? And I think that's something we really have to rethink. There is another.
Tone, can you stay right there for a second? Because I'd like to point out a factor here, and have you maybe react to it. Because I look at that. I'm glad you explained what that facility was. From a design standpoint, again, when you're looking at this desolate, kind of very this space that I think what we should be thinking about in terms of causing this crash, lulls a driver into a sense of complacency. It gives them lots of room to move. What we have decided here from a design standpoint is that the very small number of turning movements there warrants its own turn lane.
Right.
And I think that that in itself feels questionable, especially given the trade-off of higher speeds that you're seeing. But I think it's important also to point out how the higher speeds are actually what makes that turn lane required. If speeds were much lower, you wouldn't need such a large gap in order to turn. You wouldn't need to get vehicles out of the way so that the other ones could get through. You wouldn't be worried about like rear end collisions. If someone slowed down and was making a turn, you would have a more functional urban area. And it's almost like the design assumptions have built upon themselves and given us, delivered to us a highway with highway geometries in the middle of a university, an urban university.
That's right.
And those two things don't mix, right?
And I think that's goes to the heart of sort of the other point that I want to make is, how do I go back here to the original Google is, King Edward is a miserable, the street itself is quite miserable because it's treated as a shortcut, because the normal route that you would take to get off the highway if you were following truck routes and so forth is you would go along the Nicholas bypass, which is this horrendously ugly thing that runs along the canal, and then you would make a series of absolutely miserable, as a traffic engineer, you must hate this, Suzanne is laughing at this, you make an absolutely horrible series of lefts and rights and lefts and rights through urban streets to get back onto the 8-lane wide King Edward Avenue to get onto the bridge to take you across the river. And dozens of people have been killed on King Edward Avenue on the further north end of it, past the university campus. So because it's such a miserable road and it's so awful, but it's used by trucks, cars will take the rest of King Edward as a shortcut through campus. So I don't want to say we have to make people's lives miserable, but if we made King Edward Avenue as it goes through the campus a more pedestrian-friendly, pedestrian-first, cyclist-first street and really radically slowed down traffic, car drivers would say, oh, this is such a terrible street. I hate driving down here. I'm going to go take the street that's actually designed for me and go use Nicholas. Now, that's not going to solve the problem of the misery of that design, but it underpins the whole problem of our overall design for getting traffic from the highway to Quebec is miserable. And we don't have a good solution to that because our only answer seems to be several $1 billion for a tunnel that most trucks can't use.
Tony and Suzanne, I think you might have something to add here too, but maybe to reinforce that, I'm sure that it is a factor in inducing traffic volumes. I know we've looked at the intersection and the things that would cause people to speed, cause people to not see a pedestrian standing there, cause this crash. But I think the underlying question of what is causing the traffic to choose this route itself, it is very important. On the south here, you see the highways converging and this kind of off-ramp thing I showed earlier into the intersection that we're at. People might not be aware, if you drop in up here on the north end of this, if you continue going through the crash site and continue going north, you end up in a section that is very Strodish. I mean, this is a highway in the middle of an urban neighborhood and something, really, really not compatible with a city, not compatible with trying to bike across or do whatever. But it's easy to see why people, especially at 5:30 in the morning, would choose this as a shortcut, as opposed to, other routes they could take to get further north. And that certainly is inducing people with a non-destination mentality. Maybe I'll say that. Someone who is a destination driver, I'm exiting off the highway, I'm exiting off the road, I'm entering an urban street, and I'm going to look to find a place to drop my car and then walk to wherever I'm going. That person will have a different mentality as they navigate than the person who is, I'm on my commute, I'm heading through, and I'm heading to places further north. We don't know the mentality of the driver. We don't know what their destination was. We don't know who they were, but I think it's certainly a factor in making this intersection more dangerous, that we have decided as a policy that we're going to channel people who are non-destination drivers through this area that we are prioritizing university students, people walking, people biking, and just urban life. Suzanne, is that fair? You're on the ground, so I'm looking at it.
I think for sure. I mean, obviously these things have developed organically over, hundreds of years, right? King Edward is a very old road. And so it's had to change its function many times over the years. I think one other thing worth mentioning is that it operates very differently most of the day than when 5:30 in the morning. The operations would be very different. But if you were, say, looking for a shortcut in the middle of the day, it would not be a good choice because it's very congested. Speeds would be lower, and it's not super convenient. I think that's one of the challenges we have, right? I was looking at the left turn lane and I was thinking, okay, well, why is it so long? Because really Somerset dead ends after like a block later. It could be that it used to be, or maybe it still is, the access to a parking facility. So it might have these surge access times, and that's why I'm not trying to justify that as a continuing excuse to have it there, but there might be these kinds of reasons, and it takes time to kind of change things. But yeah, like just to recognize that it does operate very differently at different times of day, and that means that anything that we do to change the design might not actually make a difference in the off-peak periods. And even if the King Edward has about 10,000 vehicles per day, and even if we say 99.99% of the people that drive there are responsible, they're conscientious, they're going to pay attention to the cues that we're giving them to drive slower, that it still leaves room for one person a day who is a risk taker, who will drive aggressively even when conditions are not conducive for them to do that. So there's an exposure, and I don't know anything about the driver who was involved in this crash. I'm not saying that could be that person, but we can't design the road for that 0.01% of people and actually, like what we found out from the Fatal Collision Review Committee was that a lot of the people involved in fatal crashes do have a very bad driving record. So that's kind of another piece of the puzzle that we were trying to learn more about as we try and figure out how, will the road design make a difference? Will people still decide to drive aggressively even when it's not conducive?
And I feel like that's the key factor, is there are always going to be, well, very rarely is someone going to actually maliciously drive badly, but the chances are that somebody can make a mistake, can have a problem, that there's a vehicle malfunction, that they hit a patch of black ice. Like there's always the possibility that unintentionally something can go wrong through their error or otherwise. And that underpins the entire City of Ottawa sort of approach is, we should be adopting a Vision Zero approach. And our goal is instead to reduce, instead of Vision Zero, our goal is to reduce fatalities by 20%, which isn't really a very aspirational goal. And that's part of our problem, is that we need to think about this from a design perspective of solving these issues and actually prioritizing what's at stake, which is someone may make a mistake. This driver of this car, made a mistake, drove too fast. What were the factors that induced them to drive at an excessive speed, and that led to this, that how it could have been either avoided completely or avoided catastrophic injury or death. And I think there are a number of design factors, and we've talked about them, narrowing the road. The maximum width for a bus is 3.2 meters. So in my opinion, if a street has a bus, well, you need 2 lanes that are 3.2 meters wide. So that means the bus has to go really slowly when they come mirror to mirror. But you know, we could make the road 6.4 meters wide, and that would be fine. And it doesn't need to be any wider than that. And we need to think about how we design our roads and our streets, especially in tight urban conditions like this.
And if I can just jump on that for a second, like I also think that we need to have these discussions before crashes happen, right? Like, so we're doing this reactive kind of response thing, right? So someone's killed, what can we do to prevent it, and go from there? But really, we know it's about exposure. We know there's thousands of pedestrians, relatively young people, as young as 18 to, you know, their late 20s, crossing there every day, and that's just the University of Ottawa population. So we have to take a look at those things, and my point about maturing as the way we look at how we move people through our cities is coming up with these proactive solutions prior to the problem happening. And I think, you know, to piggyback on what Toon is saying, you know, that's really where we need to be going. And regardless if you have a Vision Zero statement or not, we know it's a responsibility of municipalities to do the right thing, move people safely.
Yeah, that's really well stated, and could be a good segue to kind of move us into recommendations if we're ready. I know I heard one recommendation there around narrowing the road and kind of looking at 3.2 meter lanes and then potentially a full width of 6.4 meters. I'm curious if Suzanne, maybe if you've had other recommendations come to mind as you were going through the materials and as you did your site visit.
Yeah, so actually Rob and we did a site visit the other day, and I did go through the intersection at night. So and I did actually see, it was morning, it was 5:30 in the morning that I went. I did actually see a pedestrian, and the signals were very visible. I know we talked about, you know, is it possible that the trees would block the signals or even camouflage them if they were in their full beautiful fall color mode? Possibly a factor, but at night it's dark and the signals are very bright. So yeah, I really do agree with, are there ways to enhance visibility using lighting, and then clearing some of the vegetation and maybe even improving the sight distances. But the idea of narrowing the road and even creating a zone through there where there are repeated raised intersections, recognizing that there are many places along King Edward where students and people will be crossing. There's desire lines all along there to access the campus. There's many places further north, especially, that the students would want to cross. So yeah, if there are ways to actually physically require that cars slow down, then that's great, I think. And we know that raised intersections do that. It forces drivers to slow down. And I used to work in traffic calming, so I know, like, our standard response to that is what people will say, oh, well, then traffic's going to go to other routes. And sure, we kind of want them to go to that Nicholas route, but the other thing is that, or they just drive at a more appropriate speed for what the conditions are requiring, and they stay in a focused mode. So yeah, and I guess the other thing on my list I was just looking is the tunnel, right? That Toon mentioned, that we actually have studied that repeatedly. This is such a contentious corridor that considering spending billions of dollars on a tunnel has been studied. And then I want to just put a plug for one thing, because I know, so Vision Zero and Safe System Approach, we're thinking about transportation as a system, and one of those is safe vehicles, and we focus on the safe road design a lot, but I think, you know, at the end of the day, like I was trying to express earlier, you know, if the road is straight, people are going to drive fast if that's what they are wanting to do, and so having cars that actually limit the speed that that they can drive at. I think that's great. So it's happening in Europe. It's intelligent speed assist, and we could potentially start thinking about that here too. Just taking that decision away from drivers. We will drive the speed limit. Yeah, I've been doing this for a long time, and I know like we have roads that have very, very narrow because they're poorly maintained, and people will still drive. And icy winter conditions, they will still go 120 kilometers per hour and end up dying or killing somebody because of that risky behavior routinely. And there's just a part of me that thinks that we can't design the road, can't design that away from those drivers.
Yeah, understood. Routinely risky behavior. I think that's a good way to kind of summarize that. Okay, thank you. Maybe Tone, any further thoughts and recommendations?
So one of the thoughts is that we need to make a much more accessible city, and we pay a lot of lip service to accessibility in the public realm, and it's tough to implement, especially when you think about snow and winter and snow plows and things. But I think about something like, if the driving surface was cobblestones, and that already automatically causes people to go slower, not precast concrete, but actual like stone cobblestones. That combined with using different colored stones, using a dark granite for the stones and then a white granite for the lines, or not having lines at all, and making the street narrower so that it's smaller and induces smaller speed, and making the sidewalks and raised intersections out of concrete so that they're smooth and they're accessible. Things like that, subtle clues that are auditory. Driving on cobblestones and your car's wobbling and bumping is going to cause people to start to go slower. And we can see how that can impact behavior and influence behavior through better design. I think we have an absence of policy, and I hate to be the guy who says we should have one more policy, but we have an absence of coherent policy and how it's applied. We have a City of Ottawa guidelines that say you shouldn't ever put in sweeping corners at intersections. And they should be a hard right. And yet we still build them. The sort of slip lane design, we still build them, and we build them on brand new roads, even though we say you shouldn't do them and you should only do them under certain conditions. We don't have some sort of a mechanism for encouraging, through a better design process that is collaborative, that certain provincial legislation that's never been enacted would cause that kind of design thinking to be more prevalent and to be more predominant, and we would get better design quality, and we would spend a little bit more effort in figuring out those solutions up front when it's on paper, mapped out, tested, and then we would have better test cases.
Yeah, the design thinking with coherent policy, and then I like what you said about cobblestones too, right? Like in the auditory aspect of that, that's something that happens to me in my city quite often as I go across different textures. Thank you. Rob, anything you'd like to add in the way of recommendations?
Yeah, and certainly from my perspective, Tony, I'm a huge advocate of technology. Mm-hmm. And so that corridor itself lends itself exceptionally well to automated speed enforcement in terms of clear sight lines and kind of getting people to comply. And so one of my recommendations would be for any municipality to look at making that into a community safety zone, doubling the fines for speeding and all sorts of different kind of interactions that drivers can do, and then adding in speed cameras. And making them function at all hours of the day, knowing the amount of volume that crosses over east to west. We would just have them staggered, all throughout that corridor, which would be another way until we can physically modify it, would be just a massive way to increase compliance with the posted speed limit.
Right. Compliance with the posted speed limit. Yeah, I think that makes sense to me too. Chuck, anything you'd like to add on recommendations?
I have a lot.
Yeah.
I feel this sense of urgency in something like this. And if this were me, if I, were in a position to do this, that sense of urgency would make me focus in immediately on speed being a problem. We're seeing, it's one thing to say there's reckless people out there and they're going to drive in deviant ways. It's another thing to recognize that we have a really high percentage. I mean, what was it? 59% of people are going over the speed limit. This is not a few bad apples. This is like a broad thing. And either we're going to say that the citizens of Ottawa are just deviant people, or we're going to acknowledge that there's something about the design here. I don't think that's true, Tone. I don't think they are deviant people. I think they are great, wonderful, beautiful people. And I think that we have given them a system that appeals to their worst kind of instincts. And it does, like I said earlier, kind of lull them into a sense of security, which the natural thing in a high performance vehicle, when you have a sense of security, is to put the foot on the gas. I would go out today because I have a sense of urgency, and I would take the orange construction bollards and I would place them periodically on those 2 blocks prior to this intersection. I would bring them out. I would place them in those parking spaces, and I would just constrict the space. I wouldn't have a whole line of bollards, but you can think of them of where would you have temporary crossings ultimately be built. I would space them like that. What you want to do is, in the absence of any kind of side thing that signals to drivers you're entering an urban space, you actually want to constrict their movement so that they feel that urgency to, okay, I'm off the highway now, I'm entering someplace else, I'm going to slow down. We could literally do that in the next hour, and it would have a huge impact on speeding. It would reduce speeds, and it would reduce the tension in that intersection. By the end of next week, I would go out and I would put lights on those signalized poles. Temporary lights. I mean, we can put those on the poles. We can attach electricity to it. It would be very cheap, a couple $100 each. And I would light up where the people are going to be standing on the corners of that intersection, so that as I'm coming into that, I could see them. They would be lit up. They wouldn't be in shadow. They wouldn't be hidden. And at those kind of very sensitive, vulnerable times of day, they would be more lit up. I would also just, at this particular intersection, trim back some of those trees that were up, that were kind of blocking or blending in with the specific crash site here. Long term, I would take those places where we put bollards and I would experiment with where they needed to be in order to create that edge friction that slowed traffic down enough. And I would have in my kind of short-term capital improvements plan to go out and turn those into bump outs that could evolve into those mid-block crossings. You've got some very long blocks. You could have 2 crossings on each one. Even if they weren't high pedestrian use, having that friction there, that edge friction for drivers, is going to slow things down and kind of give them that transition to the urban area. I think if you were serious about it, you could get an urban designer out to help with how those looked and make them even more useful for people on foot. Ultimately, the intersection itself needs to be redesigned. I realize that we can't do that today or tomorrow, but with paint, we could actually go out and constrict some of that driving space, allow it to open up once you enter the intersection. But as you enter the intersection, have it constrict people. What we want is the driver to slow down when they're in and then navigate the intersection. Tone used the Woolnorf concept earlier. I'm not suggesting that we go full that way in that intersection, but I think we can start to work towards that. Certainly when you have a green light, what we want is not the aggression of the space is wide open, I own it, but we want people to be kind of aware that there's complexity and turning movements and things going on. So enter the intersection slow, and within the intersection have a lot of movement. I think we can design that and do those changes with paint temporarily, like right now, like next week. But over time, that intersection needs to be redesigned, tightened up. The bulbs, the things need to, the corners need to bulb out a little bit more, tighten up that space, but allow the movement within. I think we can actually do that with a reasonable price tag too, something that would be, 5 to 6 figures, not 6 to 7 figures, if it were a priority for us. I don't know as you'd have to prioritize that if you did the other things to slow down traffic coming in here, which, like I said, I think you could do this afternoon with 10, construction barrels go out and make a transformative difference. That's the way that I would approach this.
Great. Thank you, Chuck. That's some helpful ways to think about it, particularly the immediate versus kind of like the near term, and then the more systematic changes that I think you outlined. Any other thoughts on recommendations or responses?
I'll jump in.
Sure.
I was just reflecting on what you guys were talking about and thinking that even having a raised median that could be wider in some places where there was room, and recognizing that I think even in those sections where there isn't a lot of frontage happening, there still is a desire for pedestrians to cross. Students are heading to the buildings on the other side, and the northern section as well. When I was thinking about the raised intersections, even the raised medians could provide a refuge even if there wasn't an official crossing there. And we know that that does improve pedestrian safety. It wouldn't impact necessarily the intersection itself, but yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, well said. Go ahead.
I was also thinking, and this is very much long-term and aspirational, is, there's not much we can do about the new building that was just built, but across the street from it, there's a healthy chunk of grass. There's one lonely picnic table, kind of orphaned on the edge. I don't know who's, using that picnic table, but things that we could do to make that street frontage more animated. You're up against the back end of a heating plant, so I can't imagine it's going to be an incredibly intensive use. But if it was parks, if it was public washrooms, if it was maybe there's a playground along there, if maybe there's something narrow that can be built in there, maybe some stacked townhouses or something for student residences. There's, I think, things that could be built that could encourage a more active street frontage on the university campus side, that encourages that street frontage to become a more active and engaged space. And maybe that's only in certain areas. You go a little further north of the crash site, and there are heritage homes. There's a couple of embassies along there. It's a much more engaged street frontage. And I think there are things we could do to engage that street frontage. And if we need more land, for example, between the street edge and the back of the heating plant, maybe one solution is to actually give the street a bit of an S curve, keep the same right of way, but hug the right side, sort of the east side of the right of way. And as you approach the top of the hill, kind of swoop up to the west a little bit, to give a little bit more land on the west side of the street, to do something interesting with a built form that calms traffic by making it do a bit of an S curve, and also does something with some building form that provides needed functional uses.
Excellent. Thank you for that elaboration. I think that makes sense to me. Anything else before we move into closing out our session today?
The only other thing I would say, Tony, is as residents of cities where we want to see change happen, we can't be quiet about these things, right? We can't let the issue disappear off the public radar. And so you've got to advocate. You've got to advocate with your local councillor. You've got to advocate with your provincial members of parliament and beyond. Because if we don't continue to try and push the envelope, we let people off the hook. And so we really can't get into a position where we tolerate people being killed on our roads. And too often, that's where it kind of comes across. There's massive demonstrations when people on bicycles are killed in our city, in our cities. We have to take the same approach when it's pedestrians. We have to take the same approach when it's, people on mobility devices and so on. Like, we really have to keep elected officials and senior staff and decision makers' feet to the fire. And because without it, we're not going to see those kind of aspirational kind of goals hit the marketplace, so to speak.
Right. Understood. Okay, I'm going to lead us into closeout then. I'm going to share my screen one more time. So I want to say thank you to our panelists today. So Suzanne, Tone, Rob, Chuck, thank you for being with us. I also want to give a special thanks to Matthew Pinder, who was a colleague that introduced me to Suzanne Woo as we were planning this session and assembling our panel. A big thank you to Kleber for nominating this crash in the first place and going through the information gathering and resource organizing that took a fair amount of time and work. Thank you to some of our other community members and colleagues, both inside and outside of Ottawa, who were involved over the past few months. And a thank you to our sponsor for this event, who is an anonymous donor. And thank you to Strongtown staff who helped with preparing us for today. So you'll be able to find a recording of this session and all of our crash analysis studio sessions by going to strongtowns.org/crash-studio. There you'll also soon find resources for building a crash analysis studio in your own community. Our next studio session will take place on October 27th, and you'll be able to find more information about that on our website as well. So on behalf of my colleagues and the assembled panel, thank you for watching this session of the Crash Analysis Studio. Keep doing what you can to build a strong town. Take care.